Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, and ever since the Creative Assembly What's Next video from the other day, I've been buzzing with ideas to make into videos. From suggestions on future DLCs and predictions, to recommendations on improvements to the mechanics and features we already have, there is just so much to talk about. However, one thing that caught my attention was that quite a bit of discussion kicked up around the reveal of Gorbad Ironclaw as the upcoming Greenskin Legendary Lord, due to the fact that by the quote-unquote modern timeline, he would be quite old. Gorbad featured mostly around the turn of the 18th century, until his eventual disappearance in 1712 of the Imperial calendar. So that would have him being at least 800 years old, which spawned a bit of grumbling from the more ornery longbeards in the room. This then led to further debates about how Greenskins, particularly orcs, even age within Warhammer fantasy. Surely Gorbad would have died of old age by this point. But no, some people say, isn't Grimgor Ironhide something like 2,500 years old? Of course not, others cry. That's just some stupid nonsense that Loremaster of Sotek said, and that isn't true because he's a lazy nerd that just doesn't know the lore. Well, now it's just personal. So, I thought for today's video, it would be fun to examine just what is the lore surrounding the age of Greenskins. Could Gorbad Ironclaw still be alive nearly 1,000 years after his great invasion of the old world? Is it even possible for Grimgor Ironhide to be 2,500 plus years old? Well, why don't we examine some readings and talk about it? Plus, Indie Pride or Milk and Cookies Total War asked me about it, so now I just gotta do a deep dive, so that people can draw their own conclusions about this subject. Before really delving into this video, I do want to take a moment to express that this is quite literally a pointless discussion when it comes to Total War Warhammer 3. The Total War trilogy does not have a consistent and true timeline. It is about packed with contradictions and characters interacting who have no business being in the same room with one another. For an easy example, Azhag the Slaughterer canonically dies in 2515 of the Imperial calendar, but Tsarina Katerin doesn't even take the throne until 2517. That's before you even look into Rapunzel de Lyonesse running around in the modern era, despite being born in 1990 of the Imperial calendar and never becoming a Grail Knight, meaning she at most lived for around 100 years? And Grom the Paunch is out terrorizing Bretonnia, despite never being seen again after his defeat on Ulthuan in 2420 IC. While I could sit here for hours and try to conjure up lore excuses about how this is all possible, ultimately, it's all made up bullshit and doesn't matter. The goal is mostly to get all of the characters that appeared in 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy Tabletop into the game, and then turning to adjacent sources like White Dwarf, older editions, and supplementary campaigns such as Shadows over Albion, Storm of Chaos, and the Nemesis Crown when appropriate. So don't try too hard to rationalize it, because it's all made up anyway, by a bunch of authors who always disagree with each other, and the canon of Warhammer is extremely fluid. So, with that out of the way, let's dive into some lore. Unlike most videos, instead of just telling you all about my findings after delving into the lore, we're going to instead look at specific quotes and information so that you can draw your own conclusions and I can just stay out of it. So, just how old can orcs get? Our research shall begin with turning to the roleplay games, as they provide considerably more information and lore than the army books will bother with, though we will turn to those as well. The 2nd edition Old World Bestiary is an excellent read for many reasons, but for our purposes today, we will be reading the following passage on page 22 in regards to Greenskins' physiology. It is worth noting that the following text is given in quote-unquote God voice, meaning it's stated as an outright fact as opposed to an in-universe theory or opinion said by a character. Quote, "Orc culture is based on the idea to oppressively rule the weak. Larger, stronger orcs are accorded higher status. And indeed, an orc can potentially keep growing throughout his adult life. This growth only stops when the orc reaches his natural stopping place in the Greenskin hierarchy, just below an even larger and tougher orc. End quote. So, what this tells us is that orcs don't have an upper limit to their size, only being determined by their station within their culture should they encounter something capable of bullying them into stunted development. For the likes of our Grimgor Ironhides, Gorfang Rotguts, and Morglum Neck Snappers of the world who have no equal and tend to continually swell their hordes with ever more tribes, this possibly results in endless growth, so long as they can keep up momentum. This is fascinating, of course, but also not as detailed as one would like. Is there an upper limit to this growth? If they lose a battle and their horde shrinks in size, does that halt their growth? Does absorbing other tribes and defeating other war bosses then cause some kind of increase in size? It would go far into explaining the absolutely staggering size of Grimgor and Gorfang, at least, who absolutely tower over other Greenskins and are easily on par with ogres and trolls. This also doesn't apply just to orcs. Grom the Paunch and Skarsnik are both goblins who grew absolutely massive compared to their original sizes once circumstances changed and they both catapulted into the absolute height of Greenskin hierarchy. While with Grom, the troll meat he once nearly died to certainly played a key role in that initial growth spurt, Skarsnik goes from being a much smaller than average goblin by the name of the Runt, later upgraded to Runtgit, to impressively tall by Gobbo standards. Here's an excerpt from the Skarsnik novel covering the topic. On page 236 of the Carrick 8 Peaks Omnibus, we have the following. Quote, "The moons were high by the time he made it to the shaft. It was surprisingly small, he having grown so mighty since his exile. He still fit, his mail scraping on the chimney walls as he made it down and down into the depths. His limbs, grown large on power, good meat, and war, were barely aching by the time he made it to the bottom." End quote. And a page later, when he encounters Little Biggins, which were the elite night goblins of his former tribe that used to be considerably larger than him. Quote, "The dicing goblins, all Little Biggins, looked up at Runtgit and leapt to their feet. He was pleased to see that he was bigger than all of them." End quote. And another quote that we have from the start of chapter 19, when Skarsnik, still known as Runtgit, encounters one of his old rivals. Quote, "A big shape stood from a chair made of skaven skulls. He leaned against a fence of spiked wood and bone. Snotruck. He had grown big and muscled since Runtgit had departed. Like him, he had gained the size of rank." End quote. For the final quote from this book, we'll turn back to near the beginning on page 64, when the human author of the book encounters Skarsnik for the first time. Quote, "Upon the throne sat a goblin of prodigious size. He was so much larger than his fellows, as to appear of another breed entirely. His long pointed hat, threaded through with bone spikes, made him appear ever the larger. But he exhibited the same features as his lackeys, the same sharp teeth, the pointed chin, the long hooked nose, although they were altogether more noble a cast. Here was a lord of power. I could tell the moment I saw him." End quote. So, taking all of this together, we have our helpful spot of information that Greenskins only grow larger and more powerful as they age, so long as they can continue to acquire power and win battles, which of course opens a massive can of worms about how their beliefs and self-imagery impact their physiology, but we don't have time for that right now. So, now that we've discussed that Greenskins can grow quite large given enough time, let's talk about some specific examples of Greenskin ages that we can find. Skarsnik is quite a bit older than most think he is, being at least well into his 70s, but the saga of his tale makes pinning down his exact age quite difficult outside of, quote, many decades, end quote. So, who do we turn to then? Well, none other than Gorfang Rotgut Troll Eater, the Squatter King of Blackcrag. Many people, I think, tend to assume that orcs and goblins will die of old age by the time they're in their 50s, or maybe 70s, or early 100s, but that is far from the truth. Gorfang's life isn't measured in decades, but in centuries. Let's take a look at this excerpt from the novella Thorgrim, in the chapter King of Blackcrag. Quote, "Zargak is my shaman," Gorfang shouted. His voice was as rough as a fistful of gravel. The tusk-like fangs he bared boasted centuries of growth. They were crusted and vicious. The skin of his face was dark green and tough as an old tree that should have been cut down years ago. His shoulders were stooped under the weight of his plate mail. That and his impressive burden of years. End quote. Mad Zargak, who's the character mentioned, is even older. An orc great shaman that is truly ancient, even when compared against Gorfang, likely having been around for maybe thousands of years, as we have a note of all of his teeth having fallen out, with weird mushrooms growing out of their sockets in his dry and cracked gums instead. Ugh. So now, we know beyond a doubt, through a direct quote, that we can have active and powerful war bosses who are none the worse despite being centuries old. Gorfang quite literally never feeling any weaker or slower despite his age. At worst, he uses a boar chariot to get around long distances instead of walking, as he refuses to use the chariot in battles. But even this doesn't indicate any weakness, instead only being interpreted as a hopeful sign that he's slowing down by one of the characters being an orc named Bograt. Moving on to shamans, who instead are constantly wrestling with the weird powers of Wa energy, they are also able to live to obscene age, but it seems to come at a cost to them physically and mentally. They're bizarre and strange entities, even by the extreme standards of wizards. But it isn't age itself that debilitates them, and it certainly doesn't weaken them. So, do we have any examples of greenskins that do die of old age? Well, no, not really. The closest thing would be maybe shaman shrooms, which are bizarre large mushrooms that are formed when a night goblin shaman eats too many weird magical fungi, which results in them evolving into a big mushroom. In this form, they're believed to still be conscious and aware until they're inevitably found and eaten by another night goblin shaman, as those shrooms provide incredibly potent powers. All that to say, there's no source that I'm aware of that tells us greenskins can even die of old age. The few we do encounter that are exceptionally old are only bigger and better. Only shamans seem to physically degrade in some ways, but that has to do with the consequences of Wa magic instead of natural things. If anyone is aware of a source that contradicts this, please do let me know down in the comments section below, as I would love to read it. Now then, with all of that out of the way, let us also turn to the two primary questions that seem to have really kicked off this discussion in recent days. The first and simplest one to answer is, could Gorbad Ironclaw still be alive 800 years after his defeat? Based on the evidence that we have listed, the extremely blunt answer is yes. It is technically possible for him to have limped away into obscurity despite everything and lived on. We have very little information about greenskins in the Warhammer world outside of the old world, so perhaps he went deep into the Southlands, or wandered east until joining up with the orc tribes around the Darklands, or the Eastern Steppes, or the Chaos Wastes, or the Mountains of Morn, or Cathay, or any other of the many lands east of the World's Edge Mountains. Now, is it likely that he escaped and survived? Well, let's look at the information we have. There are two main points against Gorbad Ironclaw's survival. The first is the rather nasty wound that he took during the Battle of Grunberg outside the city of Altdorf when the Empire realized they needed to try and stop him before he surrounded the city. Let's take a gander at this quote from the Orcs and Goblins 8th edition army book on page 18. Quote, "Although his elite Ironclaw boar boys were falling around him, no lance or blade seemed able to topple Gorbad. Instead, Gnarla pushed through the foe while Gorbad hacked around him. Just as it seemed that Gorbad would fight his way out of the thickest knot of Empire knights, Adolphus thrust his gleaming runefang and pierced the orc commander through his massive chest. Gorbad roared his anger and, with his iron gauntleted hand, tore out the penetrating blade, ripping off Adolphus's arm at the socket." End quote. This is followed a couple of paragraphs later by the following, which takes place several weeks after this incident. Quote, "Hampered by his wound, which would not heal, Gorbad still retained his cunning." End quote. Now, that may seem unsurprising at first, but orcs in particular are incredibly hardy and heal from even the most devastating of wounds with concerning ease. Here's a note on the subject in the same 8th edition army book on page 36. Quote, "Luckily, orcs do not register pain as do other races. A typical green-skinned lout won't let a minor injury, such as a severed limb, keep him from fighting. Orcs are so tough and resilient that if the arm can be found and sewn back on, however crudely, it will heal quickly. Orcs naturally take their robust physique for granted and regard everyone else as weak, puny, or squishy." End quote. Here, we can see how unusual and nasty this particular wound Gorbad took is, as it refuses to heal throughout the remainder of the story. Seeing as Count Adolphus of Wisenland struck the blow, it is likely that the runefang was Bloodbringer, or Damas Vingren as it's also known. So that already doesn't look particularly great for Gorbad, but perhaps it will simply be an epic wound that makes him all the more terrifying. On to the second piece of information, which is how the saga of Gorbad comes to a close. After his numerous attempts to take Altdorf end in failure, he finally retreats back across the Empire and through Blackfire Pass, only to find a dwarf throng waiting for him, led by the High King of Karasakarak. Let's together look at this quote about the Battle of Blood Peak on page 19. Quote, "Though Gorbad hacked a path through the dwarfen onslaught, his army crumbled around him. As dusk fell, Gorbad was surrounded by stunties, his axe visiting ruin on any who approached. That was the last anyone ever heard of Gorbad. If the orc leader was slain by the dwarfs, they have never mentioned it. If Gorbad made good his escape, it is not known to where, for none have ever heard of him again." End quote. So, there we have the greatest orc warlord to ever live, utterly alone and surrounded by vengeful dwarfs hell-bent on his death. Seems a rather open and shut case, doesn't it? Gorbad, already irritated by a wound that will not heal, is overwhelmed and brought down, never to trouble the world again, and certainly not hundreds of years later in Total War Warhammer 3. Well, not so fast. The text here is extremely ambiguous, though in my opinion it actually far more heavily implies that Gorbad survived. The Dawi would not have been quiet or subtle about the slaying of the Ironclaw, who had terrorized the old world with such devastation for years. Many grudges would have been struck out from the Damas Kron with his death, and yet the dwarfs refused to comment on the situation. This suggests not a grand tale of striking down a mighty foe, but instead the deep shame and embarrassment of letting one escape. To approach it from a real-world perspective for a moment, Games Workshop obviously left the situation up in the air so they could have options going into the future. If they ever wanted to bring Gorbad Ironclaw back into the setting for some epic tale or other reason, they had left an open door to allow for it. Ultimately, they ended up not doing so. But if they had wanted Gorbad permanently dead, it would have been simple to do so. And that's not to say that the book keeps every Greenskin big bad's fate ambiguous, as Azhag the Slaughterer is definitively killed in his tale. But Grom the Paunch and Gorbad Ironclaw are left more mysterious, though Grom, to be fair, had older lore detailing how Eltharion tracked him down and killed him in the Badlands, but that was ignored by later editions. So, all of that to answer the question, can Gorbad Ironclaw still be alive in the Total War Warhammer 3 timeline? The answer is undeniably yes. Don't get me wrong, it's certainly a stretch and leaves a few unanswered mysteries, but is nonetheless an easy yes. Hopefully, his depiction in Total War will have fun answering some of these mysteries, such as how that unhealing chest wound of his is doing, and where the hell did he scamper off to? After all, the vast majority of Warhammer lore is hyper-focused on only the old world. So if he truly ran off elsewhere to seek a shaman that could heal him, or some other nonsense, he may well have ended up in a truly distant land, like, I don't know, Grand Cathay. I'll have some additional dedicated videos coming up in the near future to discuss more about Gorbad Ironclaw, and why he is quite frankly the most terrifying Greenskin character we know of in the entirety of Warhammer Fantasy. But until then, there's one last stop on this strange little tour of ours, which is, how old is Grimgor Ironhide? Up until this point, we found direct sources casually mentioning orc war bosses reaching well into centuries of age, but can we make the argument for thousands of years? For those unaware, Grimgor is quite literally the most mysterious Greenskin character in the setting. Let's take a look at the quotes about his origins that are given to us by the 8th edition army book, starting on page 26. Quote, "When he staggered out of the Darklands with his grizzled and battle-scarred bodyguard, he started a bloody chain of events that is still unraveling. Grimgor's past is a mystery, and any that dare ask about it are dispatched." End quote. Alright, well, that wasn't particularly helpful, other than letting us know that he has some greater history that takes place out east. Let's check another entry on page 71. Quote, "No one knows much about Grimgor before he staggered out of the blasted wastes with the Immortals, his bloody-minded bodyguard. They were tired and hungry, but they were black orcs nonetheless, and particularly hard ones at that." End quote. Once again, not great. We can glean that Grimgor and his Immortals were already extremely experienced and powerful orcs by this point. Grimgor already emerging as the largest orc in the world. What we can say, though, is that Grimgor is the largest of his kind, which means that he has had a ton of time to grow. At least as much as Gorfang Rotgut, who is also quite large and is centuries old. But let's look for more direct sources. There is one book that finally gives us insight into the past of Grimgor Ironhide. But it will take us to a rather nasty place. That's right, we're off to the end times. In the unfortunate, but nonetheless grand finale of the Warhammer world, Grimgor enters the scene quite late during the final parts of the story. In The Lord of the End Times, we are granted rare insight into Ironhide and his origins. The following starts on page 340. Quote, "A grin split Grimgor's grotesque features as he recalled how the stunties had wailed as he'd torn down their city of pillars and pits, freed their slaves, and toppled their statues. That'd teach them to break their staves on his hide. That'd teach them to try and make Grimgor a slave." The grin faded, and the old anger came back, hotter and fiercer than any stunty fire pit. He lifted Gitsnik and pressed the flat of the great axe to his brow. His gnarled frame was a patchwork of scars, most earned properly in the heat of battle. He'd fought stunties, both kinds, and rats, and gits, and big bellies aplenty in the past few months. But it had always come back to the bull stunties and their fire pits, their whips and chains and iron staves. They'd given him his first scars when he'd been no more than a runt, and he owed them for that. End quote. So, here we learn the true origin of Grimgor, which hadn't been revealed until the very end of Warhammer Fantasy itself. He was born a slave of the Chaos Dwarfs, spending the entirety of his early life being beaten and tormented by the cruel overseers. This would explain, maybe, where he lost his eye, but maybe also gained his legendary weapon Gitsnik, for we have the following quote about his great axe. Quote, "This formidable axe came from the forges of Zarnagrund, and, despite constant use, has never grown dull." End quote. Now, this is all the extremely direct information that I will be providing you about Grimgor specifically, as we head into trying to puzzle out the truth here. What we know for a fact is that Grimgor is a Black Orc who started life a slave of the Chaos Dwarfs, and he managed to acquire an insanely powerful magic weapon that was forged in Zarnagrund, the capital of the Dawizar. It is quite likely, though not explicitly stated, that Grimgor was, for a Greenskin, born in Zarnagrund itself and managed to escape, acquiring Gitsnik during the ensuing violence. But when could this have happened? Decades ago? Centuries? Millennia? To put it bluntly, there is no direct answer for this. Warhammer Fantasy is not a setting that gives easy answers. The vast majority of the lore is vague at best and forces readers to insinuate information or try to discover or make their own answers through context clues. Until Games Workshop gives a direct quote, which they often will end up contradicting later anyway, there are no easy answers. This leads to folk like myself speculating about what could be the story here and having fun with it. This, of course, leads to folks like Reddit commenters trying to take a holier-than-thou stance and saying that I'm just making up bullshit and lying because, there's no direct quotes. To which I say, first of all, fuck you. How about you come up with a theory and try to support your stance instead of just being a lame-ass naysayer? Second of all, direct sources aren't even good enough, as Games Workshop constantly contradicts itself and retcons, and the lack of a direct source quote, for that matter, doesn't mean you can't find a satisfactory answer. So, in this case, allow me to provide you with some more important quotes from various books, and let's see if we can maybe fill in enough to make an answer. Let's take a step back into history and look at the last actual army book, full army book, that the Chaos Dwarfs got in regards to Black Orcs. The following quote comes from page 50 of, I believe it's a 5th edition? It might be 4th edition, but I'll say 5th edition Chaos Dwarf book. Quote, "Through years of selective breeding and the use of evil magic, Chaos Dwarf sorcerers first created the Black Orc race in the foul depths of Zarnagrund. Far stronger and tougher than orcs and goblins, Black Orcs were intended as a race of super slaves. The experiment worked at first, but the Chaos Dwarfs soon realized that although their creations were much tougher, they were far too independent-minded to make good slaves. After several armed revolts, when Black Orcs led orc and goblin rebellions, ravaging parts of the Tower of Zarnagrund, the Chaos Dwarfs decided to drive them from the city forever. With utter ruthlessness, the Chaos Dwarfs purged the tower of their creations. Many Black Orcs escaped the dire retribution of the Chaos Dwarfs, fleeing to the Mountains of Morn and across the Darklands to the World's Edge Mountains during the time of Sigmar. The Chaos Dwarfs destroyed many Black Orcs, but left small tribes free to roam the mountains so that they could recruit them later as troops in their armies." End quote. So, from this quote, we learn two very important things. The first is that there are no Black Orc slaves. I'll reinforce this with some later quotes, but people who lack reading comprehension on Reddit will often claim that Black Orc slaves are a regular thing, despite every source contradicting that, -1 we'll get to in a minute. Here, the book tells us that Black Orcs were forever driven out from Zarnagrund, never allowed back inside the city. Furthermore, all Black Orcs in the armies of the Chaos Dwarfs are recruits, not slaves. If you read the Orc and Goblin entries on the following page, it explicitly mentions that they are indeed slaves and captives. This is further supported in the modern age by the Chaos Dwarf roster for Warhammer the Old World. As you can see on their recruitment rules, the Chaos Dwarfs do not have any slave units on their roster. They're not allowed to take Orc or Goblin slaves, or any Orc or Goblin units. They can only recruit actual military units, being their Hobgoblins, who are not slaves, and a single unit of Black Orcs per army, which once again are not slaves. No slaves, only recruits. For a final quote regarding the Black Orcs from the Chaos Dwarf perspective, let us turn our attention to the Tarmakon book, which addresses them only in a single paragraph, from which we have the following excerpt on page 167. Quote, "In any case, the Chaos Dwarfs were soon troubled by revolt after revolt, and were beset on all sides by a powerful and deadly enemy of their own creation. In the greatest and final revolt, near civil war broke out, and the Chaos Dwarfs were besieged with their own weapons, and Zarnagrund itself became a battleground. The Drathzar hovered on the precipice of destruction, until aided by the perfidious treachery of the Hobgoblins against their kin, the Black Orcs were finally defeated and cast out, and driven from the Chaos Dwarf Empire at great cost. The experiment has never been repeated." End quote. This further supports the earlier texts that Black Orcs are not utilized within the Empire, and definitely not within Zarnagrund itself, to avoid such a disaster from repeating. Plus, Tamarkan's book gives us the full roster for the Black Fortress, which is, of course, the haunt of Drazoth the Ashen, and most notably, he does not have any Black Orcs. He does not recruit any Black Orcs. He refuses to have Black Orcs anywhere near the Black Fortress. So between the Black Fortress and Zarnagrund itself, there does not appear to be any Black Orcs. So every scrap of information we can find from Games Workshop itself and Forge World tells us that the Black Orcs cannot be slaves and haven't been since their creation beneath Zarnagrund itself. But earlier, I did mention another source that some angry nerd is foaming at the mouth to post in the comment section below, no doubt. In the Black Library novel, Wolfric, we get the following excerpt during an assault on the Chaos Dwarf outposts of Drongnangkul, somewhere near the River Ruin in the desolation of Asgore. The following section is on page 127. Quote, "There was a gleam of murderous intelligence in the beady eyes of the huge brutes, something that set them apart from the frightened herd of slaves as much as their leathery black skin. The Black Orcs stared at the men who had freed them." End quote. So here we have a direct source telling us about Black Orc slaves. Does this then invalidate everything said before? I would say it doesn't, as we can actually easily have both things be true. That ever since the Black Orc Rebellion in -100 Imperial Calendar, so 100 years before the rise of Sigmar and the foundation of the Empire, the Chaos Dwarfs have not allowed anyone to recreate the experiment, and Black Orcs are not allowed inside major settlements like Zarnagrund and the Black Fortress. In addition, the vast majority of the Drathzar Empire forbids the use of Black Orcs as slaves, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of the Chaos Dwarfs obey this, quite frankly, intelligent decision, because there are exceptions to every rule. The Overseer of Drongnangkul, an arrogant Thane encased in a steam-powered mecha suit more akin to a Space Marine dreadnought than anything else, is clearly a damn fool, who believes himself immune to the consequences of using black orcs as slaves. This, of course, bites him in the ass during the story, when the events leading to his death at Wulfric's hands are only possible due to the black orc slaves he had leading a rebellion once they were freed by the Norskins. However, the important bit is that this still doesn't contradict the direct sources of lore we have telling us that Zarnagrund only had black orcs within it at a single period throughout its entire history. That being from 150 years before the imperial calendar starts, so minus 150 IC, when the black orcs are created, to minus 100 IC 50 years later when the big rebellion happens. So, that leaves only one question that remains to be answered. Do you believe that Grimgor Ironhide, a former slave of the Chaos Dwarfs, is from Zarnagrund? In the end time story, it isn't directly said where exactly Grimgor was while a slave, as he never names the place of his enslavement. Though I would heavily argue that the passage indicates that he has a personal grudge and is referring to his original home as, quote, the city of pillars and pits, unquote, which is very obviously Zarnagrund. The story about Grimgor in the end times actually reveals that he only destroys Zarnagrund itself, and otherwise does not fight the Chaos Dwarfs, as he gets teleported to Middenheim immediately after taking the city by Teclis for the final battle. So, to lay it all out together, plain and simple, Grimgor Ironhide is a colossal orc who was quote-unquote born, because Greenskins aren't really born, it's a whole thing that they emerge from. It doesn't matter. He's born a slave under the Chaos Dwarfs and suffered immensely at their hands as they tried to break him while he was a runt. Runt being the term for adolescent Greenskins. He eventually manages to somehow break free and escape, getting his hands on Gitsnik, which is an incredibly powerful magic weapon forged in Zarnagrund, which means it was probably created by the Dawizar. From there, we have no idea where he went or what he did, until he eventually stumbles into the northern World's Edge Mountains at some point in the late 2400s or early 2500s, as there's no exact date of Grimgor's arrival other than recently. Meanwhile, we also have direct sources telling us that no Black Orcs have been allowed in Zarnagrund since the Black Orc Rebellion of minus 100 IC, and they're so exceptionally rare as slaves in the entirety of the Chaos Dwarf Empire that we only know of a single mining outpost that had them, which led to its destruction. Furthermore, the Black Orcs were created in the, quote, depths beneath Zarnagrund, unquote, and Grimgor's axe is literally from there. Plus, he has a deep personal hatred for that city, and it was the ultimate jewel in the crown of his conquest during the end times. Grimgor quite literally regathered all his forces after destroying Nippon and Grand Cathay because he felt Gork calling him west and believed it was to finally get his revenge on the Chaos Dwarfs for what they had done to him. This, in my opinion, is an impressive amount of information to suggest that Grimgor Ironhide was born somewhere around minus 150 IC, which would make him roughly 2,650-ish years old in the modern age. That is pretty damn old for a greenskin, but compared to many species and creatures in the Warhammer fantasy world, that really isn't that impressive. Plus, to take it further, we have to remember that the Black Orcs are a perfected species of super slaves created by the Chaos Dwarfs to be like the perfect expression of what a greenskin can be. This may well have resulted in Black Orcs maybe even having an easier time living longer naturally than other greenskins do, though once again, I haven't really ever found any evidence that suggests that orcs and goblins do die of old age. This, furthermore, would help explain why Grimgor is such a big deal and uniquely situated in the story of Warhammer Fantasy to the big unstoppable force of nature that he is? Why is he more important and more powerful than the likes of Morglum Necksnapper or Gorfang Rotgut? Well, because he's older than them, and he's bigger and nastier and more powerful, and has this fascinating overarching story about rising up from slavedom and wandering the world for thousands of years before he eventually ends up in the old world and causes a lot of havoc. Ultimately, though, unfortunately, we know virtually nothing about what his life was like before he arrived in the old world. How did he lose his eye? When and where did he get his magical suit of armor from that, quote, after being forged, this armor was cooled with the blood of dwarf rune priests, unquote? He already had it by his arrival in the World's Edge Mountain, so perhaps it was quenched in the blood of dwarfs found elsewhere, such as the Mountains of Morn out east. Why does he call his bodyguard Da Immortals? Is it because he has a bizarrely fancy word for his personal lads, which is pretty unusual for a greenskin? Or is it because he fought the actual immortals of the Chaos Dwarfs during the fighting in Zarnagrand and stole their nomenclature because he was so deeply impressed by their terrifying combat prowess, which is something greenskins do? You tell me. So that is all the information I have for you in regards to this grand mystery. You will note that during this video, I haven't given you any direct quotes that undeniably prove that Gorbad Ironclaw is still alive and well into his 700s. Though, honestly, he's probably at least a good century older than that, maybe more, as we actually have no idea how old he was when he finally took over the Ironclaw tribe and started his whole legendary saga. Nor have I found direct quotes that say that Grimgor is indeed an impressive 2,650-ish years old. But I have given you all the information that I believe relevant to draw your own conclusions. If anyone has any quotes or sources that they believe would be helpful to this discussion, please post them in the comment section below. I would love to check out anything I may have missed, as to be fair, there are something like 1,000 White Dwarf magazines out there, which could easily provide some nugget of additional information that I'm not aware of. The only reason I can find that Grimgor can't possibly be so old is simply that people don't like the sound of it. That's it. Which, I mean, sure, but that's not a very compelling reason, in my opinion. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this video and had a fun time delving into some proper lore discussion. I want to give thanks again to everyone who's messaged me recently with questions, particularly Indie Pride, as it evolved into a brain bug that I just couldn't stop thinking about. I quite literally just sat down and typed out this entire script in one sitting because, and like was reading through all my books and everything because I was like, I have to answer this. I have to do this. So please let me know what you think down in the comment section below, based on everything we talked about. Also, do be on the lookout for more videos in the future regarding all of the DLC goodness and other things coming up soon. Big shout out to my wonderful patrons for all their support, and thank everyone so much for taking the time to watch this. Take care, and I'll see you all next time.